You've heard of Carthage. You know the name. You probably know how the story ends. Burned to the ground by Rome, its ruins salted, its people scattered, its name reduced to a footnote in someone else's empire. But that ending has completely erased what came before it. In 220 BC, Carthage wasn't a doomed city waiting for its destruction. It was one of the largest, wealthiest, most densely packed metropolises on the face of the earth. A city of 6-story apartment blocks, a harbour engineered like a machine, and streets filled with merchants, sailors, and citizens from 3 different continents. So before Rome ever tore it down, what did daily life inside Carthage actually look like at the height of its power? We used AI reconstruction to rebuild the city exactly as it stood in 220 BC. This isn't the story of Carthage's end. It's the story of what it actually meant to live inside one of the ancient world's great cities. Every great ancient metropolis begins with location, and Carthage's location was almost unfairly perfect. Founded around 814 BC by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre in what is now Lebanon, Carthage was built on a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean Sea near modern-day Tunis. This wasn't a random choice. The site sat almost exactly at the narrowest crossing point between the eastern and western halves of the Mediterranean, within a short sail of Sicily, and positioned to control the flow of every ship attempting to move goods between 2 halves of the ancient world. A natural double harbour along the coastline gave the site an immediate advantage over rival ports, offering sheltered anchorage in a region where storms could easily destroy an exposed fleet. Fertile agricultural land stretched inland behind the city, capable of supporting a population far larger than the peninsula itself could feed on its own. What began as a single trading outpost grew, generation after generation, into something far larger. As Carthaginian ships established trading posts and colonies across Sardinia, Sicily, southern Spain, and the North African coastline, wealth flowed continuously back toward this one peninsula. Unlike cities built around military conquest, Carthage grew the way a modern financial capital grows, by becoming the place where deals got made, ships got loaded, and money changed hands. By 220 BC, that centuries-long accumulation had turned Carthage into one of the largest urban centers on the planet, with a population historians estimate may have reached several 100,000 people. This is the exact moment before the outbreak of the Second Punic War. The last stretch of years where Carthage stood as an untouched, thriving metropolis, its future not yet shadowed by the coming conflict with Rome. This is Carthage as its own citizens experienced it. Not a doomed city, but the beating commercial heart of the Western Mediterranean world. If Carthage had a single defining structure, the one piece of architecture that explains everything else about how the city functioned, it was the harbour. Carthage was built around 2 connected bodies of water, both entirely engineered rather than natural. The outer harbour was rectangular, dedicated to commercial shipping, where merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean docked constantly to load and unload cargo, grain, silver, textiles, pottery, and the famous Tyrian purple dye that made Carthaginian merchants wealthy beyond most of their contemporaries. Behind this commercial harbour, connected by a narrow controlled channel, sat something genuinely unusual for the ancient world: a circular military harbour, purpose-built to house Carthage's war fleet, separate and hidden from public commercial traffic. At its exact centre stood a small artificial island holding the Admiralty building, from which naval officials could observe the entire war fleet simultaneously. Ringing the harbour's circular edge were covered dry docks, individual sheltered berths capable of holding up to roughly 220 warships, screened from outside view so that a foreign visitor sailing past the commercial harbour would have no way of knowing the true size of Carthage's navy. This wasn't just clever design, it was a fundamental piece of Carthaginian strategy. A trading empire without military protection is just a target. By hiding its naval strength inside civilian-looking harbour architecture, Carthage protected the very wealth that made it worth attacking in the first place. Beyond the harbours, engineers faced a serious secondary challenge, keeping several 100,000 residents supplied with fresh water on a peninsula with limited natural sources. An extensive network of cisterns cut directly into bedrock captured and stored rainwater across the dry Mediterranean seasons, feeding public fountains and private households throughout the dense urban core. Water, in Carthage, wasn't just a utility. It was the infrastructure decision that made a metropolis of this size physically possible. Most ancient Mediterranean cities solved population growth by sprawling outward. Carthage, constrained by its narrow peninsula, was forced to solve it differently, by building upward. Ancient writers described Carthaginian residential buildings rising as high as 6 stories, an extraordinary height for the ancient world, and one that wouldn't be matched again in most of the Mediterranean for well over 1,000 years. These weren't scattered luxury structures. They were the ordinary housing stock of the city, densely packed apartment blocks built from mud brick and stone, standing shoulder to shoulder along narrow streets that wound between the harbour district and the fortified hill at the city's centre. That hill, known as the Byrsa, formed the religious and political high point of Carthage, both literally and symbolically. Crowned with temples, most notably the Temple of Eshmun, god of healing, the Byrsa was reached by a long, monumental staircase visible across much of the lower city. From its summit, a citizen could look out over a genuine sea of rooftops stretching down toward the coastline and the twin harbours beyond, a skyline unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient Mediterranean. Wrapping around the landward approaches to this dense urban core stood Carthage's famous triple walls, described by ancient historians as tall and thick enough to house stables for war elephants and horses on their lower levels, with soldiers' barracks and storage space built directly above, turning the city's own defensive perimeter into functioning military housing rather than a simple barrier. Wealth was visible everywhere a visitor looked. Painted plaster building facades in the wealthier districts, imported marble accents decorating temple architecture on the Byrsa, and brightly dyed textiles hanging in the market stalls near the commercial harbour. This was a city that had been building continuously for 4 centuries, each generation adding to a skyline already unlike anything most visitors had seen before arriving. Step down from the Byrsa and into Carthage's streets in 220 BC, and you'd find yourself inside one of the most genuinely cosmopolitan cities on Earth. The population was remarkably diverse for the ancient world. Punic citizens of Phoenician descent formed the civic core of the city, filling its senate, its merchant houses, and its temples. But the streets and markets were equally filled with Numidian traders from the North African interior, Iberian merchants arriving from Spanish trading posts, Greek sailors passing through on Mediterranean shipping routes, and enslaved labourers brought from across the region, a genuine mixing of cultures, languages, and goods funneled through a single set of harbour gates. Daily commercial life centred almost entirely around the harbours and the markets that surrounded them. Merchants haggled loudly over shipments of Spanish silver, North African grain, and the prized Tyrian purple dye extracted from sea snails, a commodity so valuable that robes dyed with it were reserved for royalty and elites across the Mediterranean world. Carthaginian agricultural knowledge was so respected that a Carthaginian writer named Mago produced a multi-volume treatise on farming so valuable that Rome later ordered it specifically preserved and translated, even while destroying nearly everything else the city had ever built. Religious life threaded through the rhythm of the city's calendar, centered on temples to gods like Baal Hammon and the goddess Tanit, with public processions and festivals marking key civic moments throughout the year. Carthaginian women held notably more independent legal and economic standing than women in many neighbouring civilizations of the period, with evidence suggesting some engaged directly in trade and owned property in their own right. For the wealthy merchant elite, daily life meant multi-story townhouses overlooking the harbour, imported luxuries from across 3 continents, and influence wielded through the city's senate and merchant councils. For dock workers, laborers, and the enslaved population, life meant the unending rhythm of a working port city, loading ships, hauling goods, and keeping an empire's commercial engine running, hour after hour, in a metropolis that genuinely never stopped moving. By 220 BC, Carthage functioned as the administrative and financial capital of a genuine overseas trading empire. The city itself was only the visible tip of a much larger economic network. In Spain, Carthaginian territory, under the command of the powerful Barca family, the same family that would soon produce the general Hannibal, controlled rich silver mining operations that poured continuous wealth back into Carthage's treasury, financing the city's markets, its hired armies, and its monumental architecture. Colonies across Sardinia and western Sicily controlled critical shipping choke points, allowing Carthage to tax and regulate an enormous share of the Mediterranean's total maritime trade. Unlike Rome's approach of governing through legions garrisoned across every province, Carthage held its empire together primarily through trade agreements, tribute arrangements, strategic local alliances, and a navy capable of enforcing Carthaginian shipping dominance whenever it was challenged. The city's economy ran less like a military conquest and more like a vast, interconnected corporation, with Carthage itself functioning as its headquarters. Even the city's military reflected this commercial logic. Carthage's armies were composed largely of hired mercenary forces rather than citizen soldiers. Numidian cavalry, Iberian infantry, Balearic slingers, Gallic warriors, and famously war elephants sourced from North African herds. It was, in effect, the ancient world's first major professionalized multinational fighting force, funded entirely by trade wealth rather than raised through citizen conscription. In 220 BC, Carthage's relationship with Rome remained technically peaceful, though tension was rapidly building. The First Punic War had ended decades earlier, with Carthage forced to surrender Sicily, and Hannibal Barca, now commanding forces in Spain, was expanding Carthaginian territory aggressively enough to alarm Roman observers. Within 2 years of this moment, that tension would ignite into the Second Punic War. But standing inside the city in 220 BC, none of that had happened yet. Carthage still looked, to everyone living inside it, like an empire only getting started. The city captured in this reconstruction did not survive much longer. The Second Punic War, breaking out within 2 years of this moment, brought Hannibal's legendary crossing of the Alps and years of brutal fighting across Italy itself. Despite extraordinary early victories, the war ultimately turned against Carthage, ending in a defeat that stripped away Spanish territory and crippled the financial machine that had built the city's 6-story skyline. Carthage survived that war and spent decades rebuilding its commercial wealth, but Rome never trusted the city's resilience again. Lingering fear of a resurgent Carthaginian economy eventually led to the Third Punic War, and in 146 BC, Roman forces besieged and systematically destroyed the city. Ancient accounts describe days of brutal house-to-house fighting through the very apartment blocks and harbour streets reconstructed in this video, ending with the city burned, much of its population killed or enslaved, and its territory annexed directly into the Roman Republic. The popular legend that Rome salted Carthage's earth to prevent anything from ever growing there again is almost certainly a later invention rather than historical fact. But the destruction itself was very real and remarkably thorough. Much of what stood in 220 BC, the twin harbours, the towering Byrsa temples, the dense apartment blocks, was reduced to rubble, later built over by a new Roman city constructed directly atop the ruins of the old one. Today, only fragments remain visible above ground, outlines of the harbour still traceable from aerial photographs, foundations along the Byrsa, remnants of sacred precincts near the old city limits. The metropolis that once rivaled Rome itself survives mostly through the writings of the civilization that ultimately destroyed it, which is exactly why rebuilding Carthage as it truly looked, at the peak of its own golden age, matters. That's Carthage in 220 BC. Not a doomed footnote waiting for Rome to arrive, but a genuine metropolis, 6-story buildings rising above narrow streets, a harbour engineered like a machine, and a population drawn from 3 continents, all packed onto a single peninsula at the centre of Mediterranean trade. History remembers how this story ends, but for 4 centuries before that ending, this was one of the great cities of the ancient world, and for the people living inside it in 220 BC, it must have felt like it would last forever. If you want to keep seeing the ancient world exactly as it really looked, subscribe, because we're just getting started rebuilding history, one city at a time.